The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 22, The Procession. Before Hester Prynne could call together her thoughts and consider what was practicable to be done in this new and startling aspect of affairs, the sound of military music was heard approaching along a contiguous street. It denoted the advance of the procession of magistrates and citizens on its way toward the meeting-house, where, in compliance with the custom thus early established and ever since observed, the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale was to deliver an election sermon. Soon the head of the procession showed himself, with a slow and stately march, turning a corner and making its way across the marketplace. First came the music. It comprised a variety of instruments, perhaps imperfectly adapted to one another, and played with no great skill, but yet attaining the great object for which the harmony of drum and clarion addresses itself to the multitude, that of imparting a higher and more heroic air to the scene of life that passes before the eye. Little Pearl at first clapped her hands, but then lost for an instant the restless agitation that had kept her in a continual effervescence throughout the morning. She gazed silently, and seemed to be borne upward like a floating sea-bird on the long heaves and swells of sound. But she was brought back to her former mood by the shimmer of the sunshine on the weapons and bright armor of the military company, which followed after the music, and formed the honorary escort of the procession. This body of soldiery, which still sustains a corporate existence and marches down from past ages with an ancient and honorable fame, was composed of no mercenary materials. Its ranks were filled with gentlemen who felt the stirrings of martial impulse and sought to establish a kind of college of arms, where, as in an association of Knights Templars, they might learn the science, and so far as peaceful exercise would teach them, the practices of war. The high estimation then placed upon the military character might be seen in the lofty port of each individual member of the company. Some of them, indeed, by their service in the Low Countries and on other fields of European warfare, had fairly won their title to assume the name and pomp of soldiership. The entire array, moreover, clad in burnished steel and with plumage nodding over their bright morions, had a brilliancy of effect which no modern display can aspire to equal. And yet the men of civil eminence who came immediately behind the military escort were better worth a thoughtful observer's eye. Even in outward demeanor they showed a stamp of majesty that made the warrior's haughty stride look vulgar, if not absurd. It was an age when what we call talent had far less consideration than now, but the massive materials which produce stability and dignity of character a great deal more. The people possessed by hereditary right the quality of reverence, which in their descendants, if it survive at all, exists in smaller proportion, and with a vastly diminished force in the selection and estimate of public men. The change may be for good or ill, and is partly, perhaps, for both. In that old day the English settler on these rude shores, having left king, nobles, and all degrees of awful rank behind, while still the faculty and necessity of reverence was strong in him, bestowed it on the white hair and venerable brow of age, on long-tried integrity, on solid wisdom and sad-colored experience, on endowments of that grave and weighty order which gave the idea of permanence and comes under the general definition of respectability. These primitive statesmen, therefore, Bradstreet, Endicott, Dudley, Bellingham, and their compeers, who were elevated to power by the early choice of the people, seem to have been not often brilliant, but distinguished by a ponderous sobriety rather than activity of intellect. They had fortitude and self-reliance, and in time of difficulty or peril stood up for the welfare of the state like a line of cliffs against a tempestuous tide. The traits of character here indicated were well represented in the square cast of countenance and large physical development of the new colonial magistrates. So far as the demeanor of natural authority was concerned, the mother country need not have been ashamed to see these four men of an actual democracy adopted into the House of Peers or make the Privy Council of the sovereign. Next in order to the magistrates came the young and eminently distinguished divine, from whose lips the religious discourse of the anniversary was expected. His was the profession at that era in which intellectual ability displayed itself far more than in political life. For, leaving a higher motive out of the question, it offered inducements powerful enough in the almost worshipping respect of the community to win the most aspiring ambition into its service. Even political power, as is the case of Increase Mather, was within the grasp of a successful priest. It was the observation of those who beheld him now that never, since Mr. Dimmesdale's first set his foot on the New England shore, had he exhibited such energy as was seen in the gait and air with which he kept his pace in the procession. There was no feebleness of step as at other times. His frame was not bent, nor did his hand rest ominously upon his heart. Yet, if the clergyman were rightly viewed, his strength seemed not of the body. It might be spiritual, imparted to him by angelical ministrations. It might be the exhilaration of that potent cordial which is distilled only in the furnace glow of earnest and long-continued thought. Or perchance his sensitive temperament was invigorated by the loud and piercing music that swelled heavenward, and uplifted him on its ascending wave. Nevertheless, so abstracted was his look, it might be questioned whether Mr. Dimmesdale even heard the music. There was his body moving onward, and with an unaccustomed force. But where was his mind? Far and deep in its own region, busying itself with preternatural activity, to marshal a procession of stately thoughts that were soon to issue thence. And so he saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing of what was around him. But the spiritual element took up the feeble frame and carried it along, unconscious of the burden and converting it to spirit-like itself. Men of uncommon intellect, who have grown morbid, possess this occasional power of mighty effort, into which they throw the life of many days and then are lifeless for as many more. Hester Prynne, gazing steadfastly at the clergyman, felt a dreary influence come over her, but wherefore or whence she knew not, unless that seemed so remote from her own sphere and utterly beyond her reach. One glance of recognition she had imagined must needs pass between them. She thought of the dim forest with its little dell of solitude, and love and anguish and the mossy tree trunk, where, sitting hand in hand, they had mingled their sad and passionate talk with the melancholy murmur of the brook. How deeply had they known each other then! And was this the man? She hardly knew him now. He, moving proudly past, enveloped, as it were, in the rich music, with the procession of majestic and venerable fathers. He, so unattainable in his worldly position, and still more so in that far vista of his unsympathizing thoughts, through which she now beheld him. Her spirit sank with the idea that all must have been a delusion, and that, vividly as she had dreamed it, there could be no real bond betwixt the clergyman and herself. And thus much of woman was there in Hester that she could scarcely forgive him, least of all now, when the heavy footstep of their approaching fate might be heard, nearer, 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 for being able so completely to withdraw himself from their mutual world, while she groped darkly and stretched forth her cold hands, and found him not. Pearl either saw and responded to her mother's feelings, or herself felt the remoteness and intangibility that had fallen around the minister. While the procession passed, the child was uneasy, fluttering up and down like a bird on the point of taking flight. When the whole had gone by, she looked up into Hester's face. "Mother," said she, "was that the same minister that kissed me by the brook?" "Hold thy peace, dear little Pearl," whispered her mother. "We must not always talk in the marketplace of what happens to us in the forest." "I cannot be sure that it was he. So strange he looked," continued the child. "Else I would have run to him and bid him kiss me now before all the people, even as he did yonder among the old trees. What would the minister have said, mother? Would he have clapped his hand over his heart and scowled on me and bid me begone?" "What should he say, Pearl?" answered Hester, "save that it was no time to kiss, and that kisses are not to be given in the marketplace. Well for thee, foolish child, that thee did not speak to him." Another shade of the same sentiment in reference to Mr. Dimmesdale was expressed by a person whose eccentricities, insanity as we should term it, led her to do what few of the townspeople would have ventured on, to begin a conversation with the wearer of the scarlet letter in public. It was Mistress Hibbins, who, arrayed in great magnificence, with a triple ruff, a broidered stomacher, a gown of rich velvet, and a gold-headed cane, had come forth to see the procession. As this ancient lady had the renown, which subsequently cost her no less a price than her life, of being a principal actor in all the works of necromancy that were continually going forward, the crowd gave way before her, and seemed to fear the touch of her garment, as if it carried the plague among its gorgeous folds. Seen in conjunction with Hester Prynne, kindly as so many now felt towards the latter, the dread inspired by Mistress Hibbins had doubled, and caused the general movement from that part of the marketplace in which the two women stood. "Now, what mortal imagination could conceive it?" whispered the old lady confidently to Hester. "Yonder divine man, that saint on earth, as the people uphold him to be, and as I must needs say, he really looks. Who now, that saw him pass in the procession, would think how little while it is since he went forth out of his study, chewing a Hebrew text of scripture in his mouth, I warrant, to take an airing in the forest. Aha! We know what that means, Hester Prynne. But truly, forsooth, I find it hard to believe him the same man. Many a church member saw I, walking behind the music, that has danced in the same measure with me, when somebody was fiddler, and it might be an Indian powwow, or a Lapland wizard changing hands with us. That is but a trifle, when a woman knows the world. But this minister, couldst thou surely tell, Hester, whether he was the same man that encountered thee on the forest path? "Madam, I know naught of what you speak," answered Hester Prynne, feeling Mistress Hibbins to be of infirm mind, yet strangely startled and awe-stricken by the confidence with which she affirmed a personal connection between so many persons, herself among them, and the evil one. "It is not for me to talk lightly of a learned and pious minister of the world, like the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale." "Fie, woman, fie!" cried the old lady, shaking her finger at Hester. "Dost thou think I've been to the forest so many times, and have yet no skill to judge who else has been there? Yea, though no leaf of the wild garlands which they wore while they danced be left in their hair. I know thee, Hester, for I behold the token. We may all see it in the sunshine, and it glows like a red flame in the dark. Thou wearest it openly, so there be no question about that. But the minister? Let me tell thee in thine ear. When the black man sees one of his own servants, signed and sealed, so shy of owning to the bond as is the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, he hath a way of ordering matters so that the mark shall be disclosed in open daylight to the eyes of all the world. What is that the minister seeks to hide with his hand always over his heart? Huh, Hester Prynne?" "What is it, good Mistress Hibbins?" eagerly asked little Pearl. "Hast thou seen it?" "No matter, darling," responded Mistress Hibbins, making Pearl a profound reverence. "Thou thyself wilt see it one time or another. They say, child, thou art of the lineage of the Prince of Air. Wilt thou ride with me some fine night to see thy father? Then thou shalt know wherefore the minister keeps his hands over his heart." Laughing so shrilly that all the marketplace could hear her, the weird old gentlewoman took her departure.